Hey Deckers, I finally got my OLED Steam Deck and thought I would have a look at 5 AAA games to see how they perform on the new OLED version versus the OG LCD one. I had the 256 gig version of the LCD and I've gone with the 512 on the OLED, so both on the mid tier. So let's see if the OLED version is worth it performance wise. Starting with Cyberpunk 2077 with my recommended settings from before, looking at the XESS on balanced. On the LCD version, you can see here we're sitting around 30 to 40 frames per second depending on the movement. It's just stationary there, we're going 40, dropping to 30. On the OLED version, we're almost at 50, dropping it into those mid 30s. And as we run through the top section here, you can see that performance is just ever so slightly better on the OLED version. Not quite seeing quite so low dips, but we are still dipping into and under that 30 frames per second very slightly. Into the combat then, up on the plaza, you can see that we're getting again around the 30s and mid 30s, not really going above that, and this is pretty much the same across the board for Cyberpunk, with the OLED version pushing mid 30s much more often. But what you will notice is that the XESS isn't quite as active and things do look a little bit smoother, and this becomes a bit of a theme as we go through. However, once we start driving around, we do still get those FPS dips into the 20s and 30s, especially in those loading spikes. But again, on average, just holding it around 4 to 5 frames per second higher, but it does still dip in and under that 30 range, so not getting you completely over 30 frames per second in Phantom Liberty on Cyberpunk 2077, but things definitely are looking a lot better. Again, as we look out over the buildings here from the cliff, we go from around 50 frames per second on the LCD to around 50 to 60 on the OLED. But one thing that you will notice is that the temperature is much lower. Less temperature, also less battery drain, and also less fan noise. Okay, let's switch over to control then, and yes, we do have ray tracing abilities on control on both the LCD and OLED, but it does not perform very well at all. So again, going with the recommended settings that I had for both the LCD and OLED versions here, you'll see straight away that we are getting slightly better performance on the OLED. But again, one thing that does jump out is the clarity does seem to be a little bit better, as we don't seem to be hitting some of the FSR or the XESS upscaling or dynamic resolution so much, so it does remain a little bit clearer. Performance though on control has been very good on the LCD version anyway, so because we don't go over that 60 frames per second, it's difficult to see if it was actually any better. But when we go into battles, the LCD version is still bouncing between 40 and 50 frames per second, especially in heavy combat with a lot of stuff going on. Whereas on the OLED version, we pretty much stick around that 60 frames per second with some dips into the mid and low 50s, but overall it does stay much higher, closer to that 60 range. Not quite pushing the 90 that people want for the OLED, but much more stable 60 is definitely a big win. If you miss control in the sale, don't worry, I'm sure it will come back very soon. On to Baldur's Gate 3 with again our recommended settings with FSR 2.2 on balance with a mix of low and medium settings. This one is a bit more surprising. Now, I am finally in Act 3. I'm still near the start of Act 3, but boy, do you see a performance difference in the town of Rivington. For some reason, there is going to be a slight disparity, as for the OLED version, I was unable to turn off HDR in-game. Not quite sure what's going on there, but I match the colours as best I can. One of the big things that you'll notice is that the frames per second is better in some circumstances, but not always. But what you will notice is the FSR 2.2 is nowhere near as active on the OLED version than it is on the LCD. So again, moving around here around 30 frames per second, just about, you can see that fuzziness of the FSR 2.2 as it's pushing the frame rate on balance. But on the OLED version, things are a little bit clearer. Not on this particular instance, but in general you do see it, especially around that fire stuff. It's looking a little bit grainy. But when we come into the cutscenes, again you'll see slightly more clarity on the OLED version, and you will get about 5 to 10 frames per second higher on the frames per second as well. So it is worth it for Baldur's Gate 3, but Baldur's Gate 3 Act 3 is definitely still a major challenge on the Steam Deck, even on the OLED version. However, the clarity difference and the HDR on the screen does make a huge difference, and I will be doing some screen comparisons in another video coming up soon. Similar scenario with Starfield. We are getting a little bit better frames per second in clarity with the resolution not kicking in so much. I did cheat a little bit though on this one, as the LCD version I did have one of the minor mods with the ini file fixes done, not with the full mod, but the ini file stuff was done. And this is where things get very interesting, because the OLED version holds pretty much the same frames per second, sometimes slightly outdoing the ini file mod version. But again, if you look at the clarity of the image, it is absolutely night and day. You'll see this in a lot of instances, although we do still get some fuzziness. The OLED version is looking so much clearer, as that resolution scaling is not kicking in at half as much, but we are still struggling to hold 30 frames per second. Now, if we did the ini fixes on the OLED version, we'll probably be holding a much more stable 30. I'm definitely getting a step closer to supported for Starfield on the Steam Deck, but it still goes sub 30 quite a lot of the time on those stock settings, even with the lowest graphic settings. Although I do have it at 80% resolution scale, but it does just look so good. I don't want to drop it that much more, even though you do get those frame stutters. As you can see with the takeoff, it just looks so much better on the OLED version without those mods. But in space, we do dip under that 30 still occasionally on those loading spikes, as well as just holding a bit higher frames per second in general. This becomes even more apparent when we go into New Atlantis, which is a major performance hog. Even on the modded version, you can see it's struggling to even hold 30 frames per second, with big dips down into the 20s quite often. And again, as we come into the OLED version, still sub 30, but not as fuzzy, though we do see some weird shadow effects around some of the characters. Not quite dipping as low into the low 20s, but still not holding 30 frames per second. So still a long way to go in New Atlantis, but you'll see again that the character models and the visuals in general are just so much cleaner, as the OLED version isn't so harsh on a lot of that resolution scaling. Really obvious as I freeze here on the character. Just look how blurry the character is on the left and how clear it is on the right. Still both around that 29 frames per second mark. So if you are looking to play Starfield on the Steam Deck, which a lot of people seem to have been doing anyway, then the OLED model is definitely going to give you a better time. That is, unless you go running it around outside Keeler. As you can see here, especially with a lot of effects going on, we really do struggle to even hold 20 frames per second a lot of the time. But again, if you can overlook a lot of the stutters as you're running around, as it's not all of the time, then it is still a very beautiful game and a lot to do. Last up is Mortal Kombat 1, and I found that the benchmarks in this one were actually a great representative of the multiplayer gameplay, especially local co-op and also online gameplay. And the biggest surprise for me on this one is I barely saw any difference at all. Now, as you'll see from the cutscenes or from the actual benchmarking that's going on here, the moves or the fights are a little bit random. So the disparity that we get in the frames per second is actually due to the difference in the moves that are going on. And I say this because I did run it a couple of times, and for the most part one would be slightly higher or one would be slightly less. They were rarely exactly the same. You'll see that there's only 1 frames per second in it as an average, both sitting around the 44-45 mark there, with FSR2 on balance. And as I come over to XESS, you'll see that that's pretty much the same again, around 43 frames per second. Mortal Kombat 1 showing pretty much no difference at all between the LCD and the OLED, but there is a huge difference when it comes to looking at the screen and the HDR. Again, I'm putting together a screen comparison on this coming soon, so you will see that difference in person rather than just the performance. So if you are looking for a performance boost from the OLED, then you're not going to get it in all situations. However, some games definitely are getting some benefit. One of the big things that I did notice though is a lot of the load times are a lot better on the OLED version, not to mention obviously having a bit more space on the SSDs in general. Let us know in the comments below what you've seen if you picked up the OLED Steam Deck and whether you're going to be picking one up thanks to this video, and we'll have a screen comparison coming very soon. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.